Welcome, everyone. My name is Roberto Veneziani, and I am Professor of Economics at Queen Mary University of London and editor of the Review of Social Economy. I am delighted to introduce the lecture titled Rethinking Internationalism by Simon Reid-Henry. And this panel is sponsored by the Review of Social Economy, the Center for Peace and Development at the University of Oklahoma, and the Security in Context. Simon, whom I am pleased to introduce here, is Professor of Historical and Political Geography and Director of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen Mary University of London. He's also Research Professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. He's the author of numerous books and articles on a huge range of topics, including but not limited to global health, human rights, the state and the police, humanitarian interventions and liberalism, the pandemic, and in particular, whether it is possible to have a theory in a pandemic, migrations, Guantanamo Bay and the recolonial present, inequality and democracy, global poverty, global public investment. His critically acclaimed books include Fidel and Che, A Revolutionary Friendship, which proudly sits on my bed table, The Cuban Cure, and The Political Origins of Inequality. Most recently, he has published a book which critics have called Monumental or even Colossal, History of the West since the 1970s, titled Empire of Democracy, the Remaking of the West Since the Cold War, 1971-2017, which is an 880-page tour de force of the history of the West. The Sunday Times has called it a colossal history of the last half century, and the Irish Independent Review has written, I implore you to get off Twitter right away and buy this magnificent book. I love this. Simon is also a public intellectual with countless op-eds, interviews, and interventions in the public arena. His current work examines the fault lines of democracy at home and abroad and the political dynamics of international public finance. Simon is one of the original thinkers behind a new paradigm for international public finance that can better secure global public goods and protect the global commons. In this capacity, he serves as academic lead and member of the Secretariat for the International Expert Working Group on Global Public Investment and co-lead of the Global Public Investment Coalition. He has consulted and advised numerous governments and multilateral organizations, including the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, the UN Center for Policy Research, and the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. I was not even sure I'll be able to finish introducing Simon within the 1 hour allotted to the lecture. So before we start the actual lecture, let me just remind you that you are most welcome to ask questions to Simon, but in order to do so, you have to use the Q&A option and not the chat option on Zoom. And without further ado, I leave the stage to Simon.
Thanks so much, Roberto, for that introduction. And thank you also to the University of Oklahoma, the Security in Context Network, and the Center for Peace and Development for inviting me to speak today on the topic of rethinking internationalism, which terrifies and inspires in equal measure. And thanks to all of you who've joined today or are watching this later. I'm going to try sharing my screen now and hope that that will work, and then I can get into some of what I want to say. Roberto, how does that work? Can you see the screen?
I can see the screen, yes, indeed.
All right. And you've got the whole panel there?
I can see the slides, but they're not full screen at the moment.
Okay, let's see if I can fix that. All right, Hopefully that works.
Perfect.
No, sorry, that doesn't work. I'll have to go with the version we had before. Apologies. Okay, hopefully you can see at least some of these slides then.
Yeah, they're perfectly visible.
Great. Okay, so thanks. Now, Roberto, now that I've demonstrated the technical prowess of one has with a new computer, as you mentioned, I'm a historical and political geographer, which means that I try to pay special attention to the political forces that are unleashed by different ideas and ways of understanding the world. The discipline of geography is not only the study of the world as we inherit it, however, it's an examination also of what we might best do with those facts. You might say that if history is the accumulation of human experience upon the earth as our home, then geography is the house. It's the walls around events that define their scope and gives them meaning and resonance. It's the structures that we as individuals and societies are given to work with. And it's the values that we absorb and forge in light of all those changes. To be a geographer, as Neil MacGregor puts it, is to ask, what does the world look like if you are someone else? And it's also to ask, I think, what might the world look like if other people had got to decide? So some of those who have tried and in cases succeeded in changing how the world looks have been internationalists. And hopefully, Roberto and others, you can see that next slide clearly enough. My particular interest in rethinking internationalism today comes from this comparative point of view. These are not perhaps the best times to be advocating for the importance of a renewed internationalism. We have, of course, the war in Ukraine. We have the legacy still of the Trump years. We have the legacy of the 9/11 wars before that, and the failure still to sufficiently address climate change. What there was in Paris that was promising was revealed COP26 last year to have been promising only of a sort. So these are not the best of times really at all, but then they're not perhaps the worst of times either, because more and more we are seeing examples of countries and movements and individuals reaching for some form of internationalism that can answer the challenges of the moment, be it the attempt to establish a multilateral funding arrangement, COVAX, to secure vaccines and to ward off vaccine nationalism, be it the efforts of the WHO to sign a pandemic treaty, be it the rise of international courts and a quasi-international judiciary, the solidarity shown by countries in sending materiel and taking in refugees from Ukraine, or even, as the Chinese government would probably argue, the internationalism of its own Belt and Road Initiative. Now, of course, not all of this is new. When Spain was at civil war in the 1930s, other countries responded with international brigades. The Cold War of the 1960s and 1970s was replete with revolutionary internationalisms of various stripes as well. So internationalism then has been an important, if until recently, relatively understudied concern since its emergence in the 19th century. And internationalism is not always progressive either. In international solidarity, Europeans are today welcoming refugees from Ukraine, and many European countries likewise welcomed refugees from Syria in 2015. But not all did, and some, the UK, for example, have adopted internationalist postures precisely so as to keep refugees out, proving in this case that global Britain and Brexit Britain can work seamlessly intact with one another, as the current British government's recent proposal of a scheme to relocate some asylum seekers to Rwanda. And Europe too has a long track record of not dissimilar deals with North African countries. So it matters not so much whether internationalism of one or other sort is alive and well today, it matters rather which internationalisms are alive and well. It matters how we think about the history of internationalism from which they emerge, and it matters whether we are able to reimagine from out of those experiences new possibilities for internationalism going forward. And in a very simplified way, that's what I'm going to try and talk through today. So firstly, what is internationalism then? Is it this? This is Per Krogg's mural that hangs above the United Nations Security Council chamber. the story, in effect, of the re-emergence of the phoenix of liberal society after the War of 1945 and the rebuilding of the world in its order. Is internationalism this? This being a cartoon rendering of the discourse around WikiLeaks at the time, which was, some of you may recall, deemed to be something which was destroying the political fabric and trust in governments and society, when, of course, other activities more overtly were doing the same thing. Or is it this, which is perhaps more of the current moment and a reminder that internationalisms take many different forms? There is actually no either or answer, of course, since precisely one of the things that makes internationalism so rich is the convergence of different ways of thinking about the same problem or challenge. The first international, for example, of which we saw the founding moment in the first slide just a few moments ago, was an amalgamation of British trade unionism, which was reluctant to critique the global reach of British capital, but wanted to protect British workers from some of the implications of that global reach, French mutualists, Russian communists who saw in it a way to disseminate revolutionary consciousness, and Karl Marx, who was his own internationalist movement all in one. Hence, the only proper way of answering this question is historically, to look at the formation of that first internationalism and other internationalisms in the 19th century, and to ask what forces led people to seek to pursue politics beyond the nation state. We'll come to this in a moment. But a simpler place, an even simpler place to start, can be to separate internationalism from what it isn't, and a few clarifications to get right at the start then. Firstly, internationalism is not itself a particular claim about how the world should be, as, for example, cosmopolitan democracy is, the idea that the world should be democratized at some transnational scale. Internationalism is not either an account of how the world is, such as realist international relations offers, something which emphasizes the fundamentally competitive nature of national interests in international relations. And internationalism is not geopolitics either. Geopolitics, as Jerry Kearns reminds us, is a discourse that describes, explains, and promotes a particular way of seeing how territorial powers are formed and experienced. Geopolitics is what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. And geopolitics itself can indeed explain some of what we are seeing in Ukraine right now. If you take the current slide, if you're able to read some of the elements of what this tells us, the geopolitical visions that have led to and justify for some Russians what's happening in Ukraine today combines national political ambitions with the interest of dominant social groups and discourses of identity. This is how geopolitics works. It's a vision for how the world should be ordered, including by force. Internationalism, by contrast, is politics enacted beyond and across the nation state. But geopolitics and internationalism can't be entirely separated either, just as internationalism can't be separated entirely from claims about how the world should be or accounts of how the world is. All internationalisms develop in the context of one or other prevailing geopolitical order, sometimes in pursuit of it, usually against some aspect of it, and they must articulate their political vision in relation to those existing geopolitical realities. So the first internationalisms that emerged then in the context of the two dominant 19th century geopolitical orders were the ones which shaped most profoundly the modern political era. And they were, first of all, the concert of Europe, which birthed us nations and modern nationalism, and secondly, the era of inter-imperial rivalry, which birthed the extension of those power struggles to the global scale. So just to very briefly offer you an overview of what they each were, the concert of Europe, first of all, was a period in which the great powers agreed to prevent another Napoleon, the great European powers, that is, and to preserve their own territorial order. It reinforced the emergence of territorial nationalism, which took, on the one hand, a Pacific form, as in internationalist groups like Mazzini's People's International League, but also a growing trend towards blood and soil nationalism, where it mattered who and how people belonged to a place. And ironically, the international connections of science and an emergent proto-international law reinforced this same trend too. And then we have the second of our two geopolitical orders which shaped the emergence of internationalism, the era of inter-imperial rivalry from around 1875 to 1945, ending, of course, at the end of the Second World War. essentially, as this concert of Europe gave way to the progressive destabilization once more of European power, encompassing now a global struggle, the scramble for Africa in the last 2 decades of the century, the 2 world wars in the first half of the new century, national economies became increasingly protective, and free trade, such as it was, gave way to regional blocs and imperial economies. So the first internationalisms that we might recognize as such emerged in and through these 2 geopolitical imperatives of nation and empire across the long 19th century, be it the internationalisms of pan-imperial missionarists, very closely bound up in the imperial project, or the internationalisms of a burgeoning scientific community, or even the socialist internationalisms of the International Working Men's Associations, the Congress of which was first held in Geneva in 1866. It was founded in London in 1864. So if we return then to our question, what is internationalism? Since it's tied to one or other political project in this way, internationalism, not surprisingly for many, implies, as scholars such as David Lackwell have argued, a teleological perspective, the belief or assumption that things are moving inevitably in a certain direction from the national to the global, say, from backwardness to economic growth. Moreover, as Lackwell notes, in the context of great social upheaval during eras such as the Industrial Revolution, or for that matter, our own, the notion of a purposeful and continuous development towards international community offers a promise of stability. So Lackwell thus sees internationalism as each of a movement, a process, and an outlook. Internationalism can be a movement, such as global civil society, usually exercising citizen oversight of transnational and supra-democratic arrangements, such as the proliferation of special issue funds that have grown up in recent years to fill the gaps in our existing efforts to fund common interests, such as global public goods. Internationalism can also be a process, such as the gradual emergence and extension of an international judiciary comprising international courts like the European Court of Human Rights or the International Court of Justice, whose authorities extend beyond those of any one nation state. The roots of this process go back decades to the emergence of an international movement around human rights, which became critical in the emergent international politics that was pursued in the 80s and 1990s. But it takes it into new areas of institutional and even global constitutional authority that enable new political relationships and possibilities to take place. So this too is an example of internationalism. And then finally, internationalism can be, indeed often is, an outlook, a sense, as noted, that internationalism is something better than what we currently have. For some, often on the left, it is a noble idea and part of a treasured heritage of solidarist thought and practice. For others, it's about the work of building institutions and systems that can manage the already globalized power relations that economic globalization and its attendant geographies of inequalities have established. One thinks, for example, of the work of a visionary like Raoul Prebisch and his institutional building efforts centered upon giving global South nations a voice in critical international processes, be it his building up of CEPAL or ECLAC, the United Nations Commission on Latin America, or his work at UNCTAD, where indeed a more revolutionary visionary, Che Guevara, stopped by in 1964 on his way to ignite revolutionary upheavals across the continents of Africa and Latin America. So internationalism can indeed be each of a movement, a process, and an outlook then, or combinations of all three, and it can also be put to very different ends. Look across history and you can find examples, as we've already seen, of right-wing, liberal, authoritarian, socialist, even nationalist internationalisms and internationalist projects supported by them. The international is not itself a preformed space or political scale, in other words. It's an arena of struggle populated by multiple groups pursuing political ends beyond the nation state. It can be used for progressive or conservative reasons, to support nation states or to overcome them. It can be democratic or authoritarian. These groups are not just state-based actors, but they include as well multilateral organizations, civil society, as we've mentioned, transnational NGOs, protest movements, all of which have assumed a role in shaping the history of internationalism. In other words, to return to our earlier question, all three of these forms of internationalism exist. And what I now want to do, since the promise of this lecture is to be able to say something about what internationalisms do and whether one or other of them warrants our more special attention, what I now want to do is to compare three different types of internationalism, to show not just something of the range that exists, but also to try to pull out some of the building blocks of a renewed internationalism that we might turn to in order to address the challenges of our own time. So what I'm going to do then is to take you through three ideal types and try to pull out a little bit of the distinctions between them. And on this basis, I hope that we'll be able at the end to draw some simple conclusions. So these three basic types, and to identify them, we need to not get distracted by all forms of international movement, so religion, for example. Rather, we want to focus on those that represent a political project on behalf of an identifiable constituency. And on these terms, broadly speaking, we can talk about these three ideal types that have existed in numerous forms across the 19th and 20th centuries, and where each were a response to those dominant structures that I mentioned at the start of the modern political condition, nationalism and imperialism. So here they are brutally summarized. First of all, radical internationalism, where the aim is, in a sense, to change inequality and power structures. And this takes numerous forms. It's taken the form of anti-colonial nationalism. So the internationalism of a Roger Casement, for example, and Irish anti-colonial struggles, which influenced nationalists from the Indian subcontinent to the later Pan-Africanism of Marcus Garvey, or the Black Pacific interconnections of radical anti-colonialists in Robbie Shilliam's account. It represents also the work of socialist internationalists, which we've already encountered, the first and second internationals, but also the tailing off, if you like, the conservatism of late 20th century socialist internationalism in the form of third wave projects led by the likes of Blair and Clinton and Gerhard Schröder. So that's radical internationalism. And its particular aim, its political project, if you like, is to enforce democracy over and above capitalism. The second account that we might be able to offer, ideal type account, is what we might think of as liberal internationalism, where the aim is really to preserve power structures so as not to worsen inequalities, but rather maintain the privileges of a status quo. So here we could think of examples such as hegemonic internationalism in US global leadership, or the British before. We could think of institutional forms too, such as post-war Christian democratic internationalism, which sought, in a sense, to ward off communism from the continent by building a modern European identity. And here, the aim is, if you like, to forge a balance of capitalism and democracy, or the project of capitalist democracy, which in a sense the EU best embodies. And then finally, we have what we might think of as reactionary internationalism, an elite-driven process which uses existing structures to reinforce inequalities, to reassert power relations. The scholar David Mottadel has referred to something similar as reactionary cosmopolitanism. It's the same thing. We could think here of the internationalisms of the neoliberals, the early neoliberals in the interwar period, and those of its post-1970s resurgence, all of them elite actors working through cosmopolitan networks to enforce a vision of how capitalism ought really to outdo democracy. And in order to secure the benefits of capitalism for certain groups, it would be necessary to pull back to restrain democracy. And that also includes other groups such as right-wing cosmopolitan nationalists of the sort we see in a Salvini or a Le Pen, who also use international connections to further their own particular nationalist projects. So here we have three very distinctive, very different types of internationalism. And already we can observe, even at this broad brush level, some basic differences and draw some general conclusions from them. First of them is that each channels domestic political projects to the international scale. You know, you can't separate socialist internationalism from the history of socialism as it emerged in the era of industrialism. You just can't do it. Secondly, each is also a response to those prior legacies of imperialism and nationalism, whether to reinforce, to reinvent, to resist. But it cannot exist outside of the structures imposed by those prior political arrangements. And then each also often intersects and struggles against one another. So we have competing internationalisms and efforts within different forms of internationalism to combine at different times. The Irish anti-colonial nationalism, for example, combining with the very specific projects of subcontinental nationalism in the early 40s and into the 1950s. But we can identify some broader conceptual points here too. First, each of them is a political project. Okay, it responds to the material bedrock of international political structures. Second, each has a consistent take on the nature of the relationship between capitalism and democracy. That's what that third column is trying to get at, that each of them works with some variant of a combination between the two, Schumpeter's problem reinvented, if you like. And then third, the fortunes of each and the range of political uses to which they can be put changes according to the way in which those four axes, nationalism, imperialism, capitalism, and democracy, play out. And if we look at them in this way, we can begin to identify some of the features that enable internationalisms in certain periods, and also that cause them to die away. And that's the last thing I want to spend a little bit of time looking at, which is to say, if we focus in on just one of these particular types, if we focus in, for example, on liberal internationalism, we can draw out some conclusions that can be useful for rethinking internationalism today. So we can go back, if you like, to our mural by Per Krogh, and we can do so, I think, with some legitimacy, because liberal internationalism has been really the dominant form of internationalism since the mid-20th century. Liberal internationalism underpins much of what we know of as international development. It underpins the realpolitik of US hegemony and the international economic order forged after World War II at places like Bretton Woods. It provides a window onto much of what happened during the Cold War as well. It helps explain what's become of the Cold War international order during the years of neoliberal ascendancy since, be it the rise of emergent powers and economies, the upheavals of global financial crises, or the domestic democratic retreat of recent years. But also, liberal internationalism was a distinctive product of the Atlantic world. And as Per Krogh's mural well captures, it was incorporated nonetheless, quite successfully, into institutions to which other countries and other regions subscribed. So what then is the story of liberal internationalism's arc of spread and success and ultimately decline? Well, I think there are in fact several, and I won't have time to explore all of them here, but let me just begin with a simple definition of what liberal internationalism believes, what it takes to be its core creed, and then from that try to work out what's happened to its history. And to do that, let me just say there are two basic points about liberal internationalism that are worth bearing in mind. Firstly, that it prioritizes individual liberty over collective obligation or equality. So it takes the market as proxy for personal liberty often, and it's geared to the protection of political rather than economic freedoms, to weeding out political rather than socio-economic violence in the world, in other words. And it can do so under quite a crusading guise, but it focuses on political violence, not on the countering of socio-economic violence. And secondly, as a consequence, this liberal internationalism needs actively defending or securing or promoting. It can't lie still. And this is the dynamic in which everything from the movement for free trade to modern professionalized humanitarianism gets bound up to some degree. And this creates, in turn, a contradiction at the heart of liberal internationalism. Here is a form of internationalism that purports to assist all those who sign up to its core political project of maximizing individual liberty, but which goes about achieving that through the erosion of structures of equality until such a point where the freedoms it cherishes have no soil in which to grow. Liberal internationalism resolves the tension between nation and empire, that classic problem of all internationalisms, by projecting the project of domestic political rights, won by liberal societies in the modern era, to all societies. But it does so without appending the political and institutional duties and obligations those rights rely upon to be meaningful. But how could this come to be? So at the close of the Second World War, the Western powers, and the US in particular, were granted the opportunity to reimagine liberalism and liberal institutions anew, on a new transnational scale. Victory in the war, for all that it had relied upon the assistance of Soviet and colony forces, was understood, perhaps above all in the US, to represent a universal global victory for liberal democratic regimes, an understanding soon mobilized through the building of an Atlantic-centered post-war architecture. That architecture, as we've seen, took the form of newly christened United Nations system, the organizations of international economic rule centered upon Bretton Woods. It encompassed the formation of mutual defense pacts such as NATO in 1949, economic agreements such as the Treaty of Rome in 1957, establishing the European Economic Community as it was then, and whose reach was later extended via the Yaoundé Convention in 1963, establishing a free trade agreement between that recently formed EEC and the newly independent African nations. In such ways, that Atlantic-based liberal international order articulated the victor nation's desire to spring forward into economic prosperity as the best way to leave behind the upheavals and destruction of the recent past of empire and war alike. And while much writing has focused on the first of those two impulses, the building of a global liberal economic order, the so-called golden age of economic growth and rising prosperity that ensued in the Atlantic world thereafter, there are reasons to focus also on the latter, at least if we want to understand what particular elements of liberalism it was that placed themselves at the heart of that emergent international order. In other words, the international order constructed after World War II by liberal internationalism was intended to promote and protect not just a liberal market economy, but liberal values too, and to do so in a way that furthered the interests of existing liberal subjects. Free enterprise was to be underpinned by individual liberties and property rights. The sovereign integrity of national states was to be upheld by international law. Rules-based international institutions were to govern these political and economic relations. Yet, as numerous critics have pointed out, the liberal order that resulted always turned more on the order part than on its ostensible liberalism. And when push came to shove, as it often did in the Cold War, it was international authority and US hegemony in particular that mattered more than any counterpart commitments to human rights. Arguably, therefore, the liberal international order has never been either as liberal or as openly internationalist as its proponents like to claim, even during the post-Cold War years of the so-called democratic peace. Now, the political roots of this go back much further, of course, to developments within 19th century liberalism itself, a political tradition which by the early 20th century, and especially after the Russian Revolution, was so concerned to define itself against the era's wayward projects of emancipation that it ended up rejecting a positive vision of politics altogether in favor of this narrower, more negative focus on the defense of liberty as the primary task of any legitimate political system, but no more. Such a minimalist vision was inherently vulnerable to alternatives that sought to do more. Such a minimalist vision required securing by means of force as well. Hence, President Truman's Four Freedoms speech of 1945, delivered just a few months before war's end, which framed this new internationalism as a largely negative enterprise based upon the core freedoms of speech and of religion, and of freedom from want and of freedom from fear. Truman's international agenda also fired the starting gun for a newly internationalist policy waged by the United States in pursuit of those four freedoms, hegemony and liberal enterprise going together, and which would gradually lead the United States into escalating security commitments spanning the globe. So liberal internationalism then thus relied in practice on both developmentalism and militarism, with liberal freedoms prioritized over democratic equality in both. But liberal internationalism also shaped the domestic politics of the time, the post-1945 era as well. Even in the US, the hegemonic center of late 20th century liberal internationalism, track forward to the mid-1960s, and you have someone like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., intellectual at large within the Kennedy administration, increasingly convinced of the fact that, to quote his biographer, man's wickedness made government both essential and dangerous. Track further forward to the post-Cold War era of humanity law, of rights-based conventions and humanitarian interventions, and you have a world in which responsibility to protect doctrines seek to justify the deployment of military power abroad in the name of abstract freedoms, whose material existence is simultaneously undermined by structural economic injustices, where poverty reduction and leveling up the poor to a minimal poverty line, $1 a day, come before taxes on wealth and redistribution between regions and classes. And it's here that we can begin to understand how the paradox at the heart of liberal internationalism drives it forward to the upheavals of today, because liberal internationalism, product of the Atlantic mid-century, was forged not only amidst the political imperatives of the Cold War, of Vietnam, of civil rights, and so on. It was also framed under the increasingly promising star of maximal equality, as the Western nations rebounded from the Second World War into 3 decades of economic growth and prosperity. Facts which made those hegemonic assumptions that the Western recipe for how to combine capitalism and democracy was one the rest of the world need only adopt to benefit from. This is the hubris that returns to haunt us today, because ever since the 1970s, we've been experiencing greater inequality domestically again, and an increasingly uneven world requires something more than commitments to minimal universal rights. This is the challenge that today confronts this dominant form of internationalism that we've seen in our lifetimes. And it's this that requires us to try to rethink internationalism in light of our own 21st century needs and challenges. And so let me end by recapping and projecting forward a little of the implications of some of these insights. Firstly, to recap, liberal internationalism won through in the second half of the 20th century because it offered the easiest, indeed a politically minimalist route to solving the challenge of how to combine capitalist globalization and democratic stability in a world shaped by the twin legacy of nationalism and imperialism. But today, liberal internationalism is a form of internationalism that's causing its own problems. And these stem from the longer term consequences of that politically minimalist take on what societies need to thrive. Liberal internationalism has enabled the hollowing out of national democracy in the name of economic productivity. It's also prevented us from democratizing the economic relations of globalization. And the consequences of these trends are apparent all around us. So what then are the alternatives? What internationalisms do we need today? Do we need to return to the socialist internationalism of the 19th century? Do we need a juridical internationalism foregrounding a regime of rights and associated international obligations? Do we need more of the philanthropic internationalism of recycling corporate gains to non-governmental organizations, or at least those who share the same objectives? I think probably we need something else, and looking at the internationalisms of the past can perhaps help us to define it. Liberal internationalism, as we've seen, sought to embed liberal ideology in a system of like-minded national states. But this strategy ebbs with the times and overlooks that the structural inequalities liberal internationalism itself creates undermine the voluntarism it requires, the participation it requires. Today, we need a separate approach. We need to separate ideology from political territory. Russia's war on Ukraine shows that can be hard, but the response also shows that it's possible. This would mean an internationalism that starts within a civic democratic frame, not a national democratic frame, one which works through national institutions and national governments as the democratic base and institutional building blocks for a civic internationalism. Such a civic internationalism would represent an internationalist response to the needs of the present, not the ideologies of the past. We might allow within it, like President Wilson, that there are moral imperatives driving international cooperation, but these imperatives should be derived not from the preferences of any one nation or class as in the past, but from the duties we derive by virtue of our shared occupation of the earth. Such an internationalism would require a political account of at least four things. Firstly, of material resource, for example, the global public goods, the shared needs we all need and require. Secondly, of political structures, for example, the strengths and weaknesses of existing multilateral arrangements. Thirdly, of values, of shared weak universals, be it human rights or the common need for trust. And finally, of power, of collective action, of what it takes to cooperate. Game theory tells us that unless we cooperate, everyone loses out, the so-called Nash equilibrium. But politics is not a one-off game, and nor is internationalist politics bound to the rules of the past. There are new global needs around which it can develop new positions. There are working agreements upon which it can build. There is diplomacy and the possibility for repeat play, learning from mistakes. And there is a vast and untapped potential for third-party involvement, for new coalitions bringing their own principles and staking their own constituencies on the shared needs and objectives of a common agenda. These are all elements that are already in play and that suggest the building blocks for civic internationalism ultimately just need assembling into a coherent political platform. This is probably the primary political challenge we face going forward. There isn't a single way of thinking through the challenge itself. There isn't a single constituency or a single group of individuals or actors that can push for this. It needs to be a cooperative, commonly built agenda. But as the upheavals of our post-neoliberal age provide, and as I said at the start, we are in neither the best, but certainly not the worst of times in which to be trying to do this. And with that, Roberto, I think I'll hand back to you and look forward to the discussion.
thank you very much for this most interesting talk, Simon. I would like to encourage everyone in the audience to ask questions via the Q&A function, and I'll read them out loud as soon as they arrive. In the meantime, just to break the ice, let me ask you, so I'll abuse my chair power and ask you a question. So your taxonomy of the three types of internationalism I found extremely interesting and thought-provoking, and especially the third column, so classifying them based on the dichotomy between capitalism and democracy and how. So there is a sense in which of the three, the one with the most unstable relation between capitalism and democracy is precisely the liberal variant of internationalism. So for the radical type, clearly democracy takes precedence, and that's a sort of a stable model, if you wish. Whereas, and the same goes the other way around for the right-wing internationalism. There is a sense in which in the liberal variant, capitalism and democracy just don't sit very well together. And one of the reasons, so one way to interpret the difficulties that you've traced of the liberal variants of internationalism in the last few decades is precisely to do with, in a sense, the inability of classical liberalism to deal with some issues that sort of become very relevant at the international level, whereas they can be sort of almost swept under the carpet at the national level. So let me mention just a couple. So the first one is the acknowledgement of deep imbalance of power. Power imbalances are very relevant at the national level as well, but in a sense, they are much less evident. So there are a lot of fora where people can express their views, one person, one vote. This is especially true at the local level, etc. At the international level, in a sense, the power imbalances explode in their relevance. So some actors are infinitely more relevant. So in the UN Assembly, it is true that every nation counts as one, but in the end, it's not true that every nation counts as one. So Fiji and China don't count the same way. Same goes with the United States and other nations. So that's one, power imbalances. The second one is literally at the theoretical level. I found it always, so one of the most prominent exponents of modern liberalism is John Rawls. He's developed the concept of what modern liberalism is. And I found it striking that his view of liberalism literally stops at the national level. So he explicitly denies that his theory of justice, which is considered to be the liberal theory almost by definition, does not and should not apply to the international arena. So all his theoretical constructs, the original position, the veil of ignorance, etc., is only valid for citizens of the same nation. When it comes to justice at the global level, he says that's just bargaining between countries, which has always puzzled Rawlsians of all varieties. So he has to build this extremely baroque two-stage procedure in his theory, whereby his original theoretical construct applies at the national level, and then something else happens at the national level. And my take on this is that democracy at the international level is actually kind of almost scary for liberals. The idea of this Moloch of an international global state might actually infringe on economic liberties that are equally cherished. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. I mean, some really good points. I think there's one area where both those observations come together. I think you're absolutely right. Power at the international level, in the way it's institutionalized, we can take the UN system as an example, one country, one vote, as you say, is democracy undermined by the reality of power relations? The inverse of that, which is your Rawlsian example, is that, democracy itself will do the undermining if you allow it to at the international level, and therefore you are best basically resorting to bargaining between positions. And Rawls' own take, as you get to on the efforts of his followers to scale him up to the global level and try to find a way of thinking through a Rawlsian solution internationally, was always hesitant, I think. And I think one area where they come together is actually, what in another language we would call governance. Not good governance, not like countries and states pursuing certain policies that we deem to be, proper and appropriate and well behaved. But I mean governance in the terms of structures, organized systems and principles by which countries are able to cooperate in ways that are fair and that do justice to each of their respective and different needs. One example of this is the UN principle of combined but differentiated responsibilities that you have in the climate discussion, for example, recognizing that not all countries are positioned the same way in relation to the problem. But that doesn't translate and hasn't translated thus far into actual governance arrangements for actual mechanisms which have actual power. So if you look at the way that, WHO operates, if you look at the way the Global Fund operates, if you look at the way that you mentioned Sceptre before operates, if you look at the way the majority of international multilateral frameworks operate, it isn't one in which actually we have the kind of constituency level approach to voting authority and power and voice that we have at the domestic political scale. And so the reason I say this is because I think we're locked in this discussion, or have been for a long time, that if you want to do better internationally, the only thing you can choose between is ideal perfect type cooperation, which never exists because power always will out, or you have some kind of global democracy. We had these debates in the 1990s ad infinitum, which is itself so abstract as to be meaningless and falls prey to the arguments of those that are against it, because it allows them to say, well, one person's going to be deciding the fate of millions of people. That's not how we want to be governed. What we don't have is the sort of representative constituency type based approaches to governing international organizations and the processes that they relate to. And that is part of the area, I think, that a civic internationalism would be very much focused on doing. It would be looking at the way in which we could organize governance so that, for example, countries pay their fair share, not simply one country, one vote, but a portion that relates to their GDP, to some element of their population size, that we can find ways of using the structures and the systems we already have at the national scale to settle these very problems. We have federalism, for example, in a number of countries, particularly larger ones. There are lessons from federalism that can be applied to the international scale that would allow cooperation to be much more productive. But what we haven't done is dare to sort of put that into a framework where we can say this is a way in which we could change the political relations, change that false choice, if you like, between the Rawlsian solution that can't ever happen and the reality of the alternative, which is power will out. And I think that's the task that we need to do. We need to build the institutional infrastructure to enable power to be managed at the international scale. That's the sort of target, if you like, of what a modern day internationalism ought to be oriented towards trying to do.
And I think this leads us perfectly onto the next question, which comes from the audience. Julia asks, how does soft/cultural power of nations play into increasing a certain type of internationalism? And in your opinion, is it beneficial?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I mean, I think, soft power is what you have also at the we don't call it this, but it's what you also have at the domestic political scale. This is what the lobby system is. Lobbies are soft power. They are collected organizations seeking to influence a standard structure of a democratic arrangement, which is to say these senators will vote in this way on this issue. The task is to use your soft power, whether it's through money, whether it's through influence, whether it's through persuasion, to get those senators to vote in a certain way. Now, at the international scale, soft power tends to be leveraged between states, but there's no reason why it couldn't be leveraged in a more multilateral context where what we're trying to actually achieve is the provision of public resource rather than simply the outcome of yes, no, zero-sum calculations on whether countries go together or not to do something. The example, if you will, of Paris. The Paris Agreement, if it was organized in the sorts of multilateral, collective action approaches that I'm advocating for, would have been a very different outcome than the one we had. And I think in that process, the use of soft power, both at national level, but also between constituencies, between groups, between classes, is actually something that could be very useful.
Thanks. Next, Christy asks, is internationalism similar to the world order concept?
No, would be my answer. But it's an important question to ask. If, in a sense, world order is about single government. It's about the idea that there is a singular framework that works for all countries. Now, we have the United Nations as a system which allows countries to negotiate on certain issues and to promote and secure certain things that they all need in common. That's not the same as world order. World order is often what certain visions, geopolitical visions we talked about before, seek to try to impose, so that one group comes out of that world order better. One group sits at the top. One group is able to charge rent. One group is able to secure the benefits that come from the rules of that world order. That's what we've had, but we see it in terms of imperialism in the past. We see it in terms of global economic hegemony, in the choices that some countries have and other countries don't have. But what we want is something where all countries get to, as it were, be themselves and have equal opportunities to explore and to protect and to provide for their own citizens on fair terms with others. And that is partly about changing the ways in which we organize the international economy. And it's also partly about changing, as we've been talking about, the ways in which we organize the political procedures by which countries come together and negotiate. Now, there are no simple answers to either of those things, but there are suggestions. And those suggestions really ought to be thought through and developed and brought to the table, because if we don't develop new ideas, new procedures, which in a sense we did do quite dramatically after the Second World War, around the Bretton Woods founding, around the establishment of the international economy as was then, but which we really haven't tried to do much since. And I think the current moment, the upheavals, the extent to which liberal internationalism, in the way I was describing, has really kind of run its course, all of that leads us to think, in my view, that it's time to begin to come up with some sensible, constructive suggestions, to dare to be a little utopian in the way that we once did, but in order to secure a way of working in the present, which is going to be much more amenable to solving the great challenges from climate. COVID is one example, but climate is going to be a much bigger challenge in terms of international cooperation. And the way we've currently addressed the COVID response does not give us much hope to think that the current structures are up to a challenge of that scale. And if that's the case, then we really do need new ways to think. We need to be a little naive, and we need to dare to think that there are better proposals that we can push for. And that requires civil society getting behind it. It requires thinkers getting behind it, and it requires governments and politicians getting behind it. And that's a process that's got to happen. But we've been too cynical, I think, for too long about how we address these problems. The long history of socialist politics that sort of transcended and turned into sort of third wayism, which was in a sense a kind of capitulation to the realities of conservative politics of the time and an acceptance of their terms of the argument, is a classic example of the direction we have gone in. And I think we now need to go in a different direction, and we need to bring forward some of those ideas so that we can establish the structures and the processes and the procedures that we need if our countries and governments and representative organizations are going to figure out the problems before us.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Simon. I have another question for you, not from the audience. So how do you see the new multipolarity and internationalism together? Particularly, is the rise of China helping or hurting the chances of a progressive internationalist movement?
This is interesting. How do I see it? I think in a way, I don't know how new the rise of China is in terms of some of the things we're discussing here. I mentioned very, very briefly in passing the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is still, in a sense, it's a Chinese approach to international capitalism. It's a Chinese approach to the developmental project that Western nations have pursued since the 1940s and 50s. But in a sense, it's still the same thing. It's still one country seeking to be the benefactor of other countries. It's still in the ODA mold, the Overseas Development mold. It's still, as it were, the opposite of what I'm advocating for, which is that we need to find ways of creating universal engagements where all countries have a meaningful say. The proposal that I and colleagues have been working on around global public investment is very much the opposite of an ODA proposal, because it's not about donors and recipients. It's about universal contributions, about even the poorest countries being part of a system, even if their contribution is very small, so that they can be there also in the governance, to have a say in the decisions, and therefore to ensure that their interests are representative. This goes back to my point about building constituencies and ways of articulating the needs of constituencies at the international scale. That's what we don't have. It's what the UN system doesn't at present provide. And it's what any of the other multilateral arrangements, which tend to be organized through funding by countries where it's very bilateral, it's very directed to particular ends. Funding of the WHO, for example, is predominantly countries saying, you can have this, but it's got to go to that end that we want to support. WHO itself has very little budget with which to form its own policies. That's what we need to change. It's what the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't take us in the direction of doing, but it's what a better multilateral form of collective action would enable us to do. And that's what I think, that's where a modern civic internationalism is needed, to try to promote those ideas and to share experiences across nations, across cultures, to be able to bring that together.
Thanks. Another question. What are the similarities and differences between the current version of neoliberal reactionary right-wing internationalism from Bolsonaro to Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Boris Johnson, and the rest, and the fascist internationalism of the 1930s, in your view?
Yeah. I think there are some parallels. I think not least, fascist internationalism, which sought to bring together a set of nationally differentiable but ultimately quite similar views around collective belonging, collective rights to belong, drawn upon, whether it was racial or other socially determined lines, and neoliberalism, which does a similar sort of thing, but it does it through the more technical language, as it were, of economic rights and belonging, but which still ultimately excludes. That still is a politics based upon the exclusion of some and the privileges of others, depending upon that exclusion. So to that extent, there are some similarities, but ultimately the two also come out of a slightly different context. Yes, there are similarities in the sense that the two are anti-democratic to some degrees, but in different ways. There are anti-democratic arguments in fascism which are quite distinct from those in neoliberalism, but they do share the sort of concern you were mentioning before, Roberto, about the fear of what democracy can do, the danger, as it were, of democracy. And this has long been an argument thrown against democracy back from the French Revolution onwards, really. There are forms of democracy that can be mob rule, no doubt about it, but an informed democracy that is transparent, that is based upon meaningful representation, that's based upon constrained political decision making, that isn't able to, as it were, resort to minority leverage over majorities, or the inverse. Those are things that we've already figured out, that we already have good ways of addressing. Doesn't mean they always do, doesn't mean that the systems aren't imperfect in many ways, but we have solutions to those problems. And so the point of drawing the comparison, I think, is valid, because it shows us that there are There are legacies of anti-democratism that flow both from fascism, from neoliberalism, from communism too, in different ways, actually. But there are also ways in which we can resolve each of those problems that we have resolved them. And while we've done that predominantly at the national scale, that's where we've been most successful. We also need to think now about how we translate some of those lessons to the international scale. And again, this is where I think a civic democracy can be valuable, by drawing those lessons together and by translating them into the actual tasks that confront us at the international scale. So no longer simply trying to assert one coalition's concern, one particular constituency's concern over another, and using the international stage to leverage that to achieve it, but now saying, how can we use international cooperation to achieve some of the things that if we don't achieve, we're all going to suffer from. COVID was a wake-up call on that front with vaccine nationalism. Climate is going to be an even bigger one. And so this is why I think the project of modern day internationalism becomes actually pretty urgent once again. And it's why, though it's not a very popular topic, as I said at the start, it doesn't feel like it's the best of times to be talking about internationalism. We split mostly between globalism and nationalism these days, but I think internationalism is important because it allows us that middle ground where we can actually affect politics between nations, across nations, and for people. And that is, in a sense, actually what I think internationalism's great promise remains. And that's what I hope we can find ways of talking through in fora like this and others, and really bringing up the agenda.
Thank you very, very much, Simon, both for a great talk and a very interesting Q&A. I think by the Geneva Convention, which is one of the pillars of the internationalism, we should let the speaker go. So thanks again, and thanks to the audience for staying with us. And let's end on a very positive note of hope for a renewed form of internationalism. Thanks again, Simon.
Thank you, Roberto, and all. Really appreciated being here.